everyone. Let's dive right in. So many, not all of you, are probably too young to remember this, but on Christmas Eve in 1988 in downtown Los Angeles, a terrorist organization seized control of the Nakatomi Plaza skyscraper, which was as of yet unfinished, actually. In the end, mostly thanks to the efforts of one heroic cop, most of the people survived the attack, but none of the terrorists did. This is footage of the terrorist leader, Hans Gruber, demanding that his Québécois, as well as other comrades, be released.
The following people are to be released from their captors. In Northern Ireland, the 7 members of the New Provo Front. In Canada, the 5 imprisoned leaders of Liberté de Québec. In Sri Lanka, the 9...
Hello, everyone. Okay, that was a joke. If you didn't get that, that's from the movie Die Hard. Now the real lecture begins. Before we begin, in seriousness, there's just a warning, okay? This lecture involves a white author who repeatedly used the N-word to describe the Québécois. He meant it in a positive way. He's Québécois, he was talking about his people. To express solidarity with American Blacks. But we are not going to use this word in class. I was going to use the French word instead, which is less offensive, but I've decided we won't do that either. So we're just not going to say it. I'll cough or wave my hand or something, okay? You're also going to hear me use another contentious word that begins with T, terrorism. This might be easier than terrorism. In the last 20 years, this word has taken on a life of its own, really. It's applied by know-nothing media pundits to everything from Black Lives Matter to Make America Great Again to kids playing soccer on the beach. I want to be absolutely clear what my definition of terrorism is, okay? Terrorism is the use of violence against civilians to advance a political goal, okay? By violence, I mean inflicting physical harm on human beings, or at least trying to, okay? Not damage to property or verbal threats. That's vandalism and intimidation, not violence. But political, I mean, it has to advance a political goal of some sort, okay? The overthrow of a government, for example, or causing parliamentary disarray, causing revolution on the street, something like that, okay? We hear a lot about religious terrorism, and I would argue that religious terrorism is political terrorism because though they might couch it in religious terms, I think most religious terrorists have a political goal. That said, though, committing a crime for profit or just for kicks is not terrorism, no matter how terrifying it might be to the victim. It's also important to look at who the victims are when we're discussing terrorism, okay? Are they civilians or are they soldiers? Fighting soldiers is not terrorism, okay? It's war, or maybe even guerrilla war, or whatever. If you kill a soldier without allowing him or her to surrender or without declaring war, that's a war crime, okay? And it might be very, very serious, but it's not the same as terrorism, okay? There are different kinds of terrorism based on whether or not a state is involved, all right? Most states in the world, including our own, do use some form of terrorism to keep their populations in line. It's a matter of degree. But in this case, with the FLQ, we're going to be talking about non-state actors, okay? An organization that is not represented by a state. So not an army or a police force, and not an organization funded by a foreign power, at least that we know of. Despite rumors, there's no evidence the FLQ was funded by France. So who are all the players in the FLQ crisis? Well, you have the militants, the FLQ, okay? Who are the FLQ and what did they want? Were they serious militants in pursuit of a serious program of political liberation? Or were they a bunch of doped up college kids whose heads have been filled with revolutionary slogans at the expense of their brains? Second, you have the federal government under Pierre Trudeau. What did he want out of this? Was his goal in the crisis simply to shut down an insurrection? Or was he really going after the whole Quebec nationalist movement, which was mostly peaceful and democratic? And did it work? Third, you have Quebecois society generally. What did they think of it? What were the long-term results for them? Were a bunch of dangerous criminals taken off the streets, or was a serious people's liberationist dreams crushed? So these are the questions we can ask ourselves, all right, as we think about this time in Canada and Quebec and the world that led to the FLQ's formation, rise, and demise. All of this did not take place in a vacuum, okay? And what we'll do after that is we're going to go over what happened and try and parse fact from fiction. Okay. We have decolonization. So in international affairs, the 1960s were the era of decolonization, which with most of their colonies in Asia, with most of the European colonies in Asia and Africa gaining independence from their European masters. Some were peaceful, some were not. But by 1970, almost every colonial empire had been replaced by a series of sovereign states. The last holdout was Portugal, and they collapsed in 75. But of course, all was not well with the world. The arms race between the US and the Soviet Union threatened to turn us all into radioactive dust. And throughout the world, the US, and to a lesser extent, the Soviet Union, were overthrowing democratic regimes and replacing them with dictatorships to their own liking. Many of these newly independent countries that had decolonized plunged immediately into war and political crisis, often perpetuated by one of the Cold War superpowers. World revolutionary feeling in the late 60s and early 70s was widespread and common among university students like yourselves, but also among peasants, workers, intellectuals, and a whole swath of society in the first, second, and third world, although they manifested themselves differently. The idea of these revolutionaries and their fellow travelers were a small minority. Okay, people often say, well, they were just a tiny minority. No, they were a large minority. They were still a minority, but they were bigger than what most people, I think, would argue. They were not large enough to cement revolutions in most places, but they were large enough to set in motion a series of programs of decolonization, at least in some places. So a good example in Canada would be the Red Power movement. Okay, so the Red Power movement, similar to the Black Power movement in the United States, but focused on First Nations in Canada. Okay, the majority of First Nations were not a part of this movement, although a large number were. Sorry, the majority of First Nations people were not a part of this movement, even though many were. Yet, as time went by, this sort of red power radicalness became basically mainstream First Nations advocacy in Canada. Revolutionaries looked at several different countries for inspiration. The first, and probably the most important for Quebec, was Algeria in North Africa, one of France's oldest colonies, and also home to 1 million French colonists. From 1954 to 1962, the FLN, the Algerian Liberation Front, fought a guerrilla war against their French colonial masters and against the French settler population in Algeria. The result here was 8 years of brutal guerrilla warfare, both towards belligerents and civilians, including widespread torture by the French army and plenty of terrorism from both sides. In the end, between 140 and 150,000 Algerians died. About 25,000 French soldiers were killed, and about 6,000 French civilians in Algeria were also killed. In 1962, France finally withdrew, but only after France itself had been nearly crippled with revolution and violence between Algerians and the French security services. So the newly independent Algeria allied itself with the Soviet Union, and it became a lodestar for revolutionaries the world over, especially in the French-speaking world. The FLN, their guerrilla tactics, meanwhile, were copied by terrorist organizations the world over, the PLO, the IRA, the ETA, and the FLQ. Not only that, but a certain French doctor, a psychiatrist named Frantz Fanon, wrote an extremely important book coming out of the Algerian War called The Wretched of the Earth. So it was a long introduction by Jean-Paul Sartre, who was the leading French intellectual of the time. And it provided a template basically for liberationist third world movements, third world revolutions. Fanon himself was Black from Martinique in the French West Indies. And after fighting for the Free French forces in World War II, he settled in Lyon, and he attended medical school at the University of Lyon. He complained there of terrible, terrible racism. So he became a psychiatrist. He was drafted and sent to Algeria as an army psychiatrist. And one of his jobs was to counsel and soothe the consciences of torturers, which he wrote about. Soon, though, he fled the French army and he joined the rebels. And he wrote The Wretched of the Earth based on his experience and analysis with the FLN. Unfortunately, he died at 35 from leukemia, but his book would go on to sell tens of millions of copies. Excuse me, Algeria, The Wretched of the Earth, as well as a new liberationist strain of Marxism, would go on to influence third world liberation movements around the world. In Quebec, which spoke the same language as Algeria and Fanon, it would influence a generation of young radicals who saw themselves as the wretched colonized, and Ottawa as the brutal colonizer. Okay, so here we have the man himself. That's Dr. Fanon here from Martinique. Unfortunately, he did die very young. And here's his book, or at least one of the earliest editions of it. So you get the idea here. Negro psychoanalyst study of the problems of racism and colonialism in the world today. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to read it. He doesn't use that much jargon, but he does focus on that. So, end of it. Okay. Quebec separatist radicals also looked to American Blacks as an inspiration, particularly after the mid-'60s when the civil rights movement became less about integration and more about militant Black nationalism, with organizations like the Black Panthers and the Weathermen replacing more peaceful groups. One of the most important books to come out of Quebec in the 1960s was called see the word there, Blanc de l'Amérique by Pierre Valliere. Okay, I just want to make a couple points about the N-word that he uses. First, as I said, the original French word, which you see printed there, is considered less hateful than the English translation of it. That said, there was no arguing what the translation would be into English. They didn't use Negro, they used the N-word. Second, the word at the time was occupying a rather nebulous space in English lexicography, okay? The N-word was definitely an expression of hate, 100%. But it was also gaining currency, especially among radicals, to describe anyone who was considered less than others or an outcast of some sort. Or it could mean you were colonized. So to quote from Pierre Valliere's book, quote, "The liberation struggle launched by the American Blacks arouses growing interest among the French Canadian population. For the workers of Quebec are aware of their condition as, N-word, exploited men, second-class citizens. Have they not been ever since the pardon me, ever since the establishment of New France in the 17th century, the servants of the imperialists, the white N-word of America, were they not imported, like the American blacks, to serve as cheap labor in the New World? The only difference between them is the color of their skin and the country they came from. End quote. Okay. For me, for most Black Americans and Canadians, and I think for most people, this is all highly offensive. Yes, the French Canadians have been treated very badly, but they were not enslaved, lynched, tortured, castrated, and forced into shanties like American blacks, or even like Canadian blacks at one time. There was no French Canadian Emmett Till, okay? And when Valliere approached the Black Panther Party to try and form a united front, they basically told him, they were polite enough, but they said, it's a different struggle, okay, for the reasons I just described. Interestingly, this is just an aside, the one Black militant who may have helped the Québécois was Malcolm X. He had been to Canada many times, and he wrote sympathetically of the French-Canadian struggle in his autobiography. Unfortunately, he was assassinated before Valliere's book came out. So, but the point was less what Black Americans thought of it, and more what your average French Québécois thought about it. Most thought it was nonsense, given the train of reforms that were going on in the 60s, but others took it very seriously. By the mid-60s, there were already political parties urging Quebec's peaceful separation from Canada. To Valliere and his friends, though, these guys were just a bunch of sellouts, okay? They were making the mistake of trying to defeat an imperial power, Canada, by means the imperial power controls, Parliament. Parliamentary power is a distraction anyway, right? The real power of the state is through violence. To meet state violence requires revolutionary violence. The idea we can all persevere through kindness, compassion, pacifism, and nonviolence is a bunch of liberal bourgeois crap as far as these guys are concerned, okay? The way you free your people, whether in Algeria, Cuba, Palestine, Vietnam, Ireland, or Quebec, was through violence and terror. Out of the ashes of the old society, you then build a new one. This was the ideology that animated the FLQ from its foundation to its demise. On the other hand, I would add that despite the title of Pierre Valliere's book and some of its more lunatic pronouncements, I find it to be a very deeply moving story of French Canadian frustration and alienation. And I do recommend it highly to anyone interested in French Canada, that you can read it, okay? In English, it's The White N-word of America. Sorry. I don't have to use that word anymore. Okay. Now, you're going to hear a lot of names through this lecture, but you don't need to know the names of every terrorist and every victim. The important ones will be in the PowerPoint right here, okay? You'll also hear about different versions of the FLQ. If you've ever seen the movie Life of Brian, it can kind of sound like that, with your Judeans People Front and your People's Front of Judea and the rest of it. Again, the only one that's really important is the FLQ, okay? You're not going to need to know about the Quebec Liberation Army or whatever. The Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ, began in 1963 as an offshoot for the Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, or the RIN, a political party which sought to separate Quebec from Canada peacefully. The FLQ, or the Felkists as they were called, wanted to move things forward with revolutionary energy. The idea was to set up not just an independent Quebec, but a Marxist-Leninist communist Quebec, a Cuba of the North, if you will. All right. The first three FLQ members were two Québécois men, Raymond Villeneuve and Gabriel Houdon, and a Belgian revolutionary named George Schoders. Two other FLQ members were come alongside, Norman Roy and Michel Lambert, who had trained with the PLO in Jordan. All of them, but the Belgian Schoders in particular, were enamored both with the Algerian and Cuban revolutions, but they failed to see the major difference between Cuba, Algeria, and Quebec. Cuba and Algeria are very poor peasant colonies, whereas Quebec is a relatively wealthy, industrialized first world province. On March 7th, 1963, the FLQ struck with their first attack, a series of Molotov cocktails thrown into a Canadian forces base in Châteauguay, and no one was injured. Pardon me. Let's get my face out of the way. All right. On the same day in Montreal, flyers appeared everywhere with a drawing of the FLQ revolutionary flag and the following warning. Suicide commandos of the Quebec Liberation Front have as their mission to completely destroy by systematic sabotage, 1, all the systems and colonial institutions, in particular the RCMP and the armed forces. 2, all the information media of the colonial language, which holds us in contempt. 3, all enterprises and commercial establishments which practice discrimination against Quebec people, which do not use French as their primary language, which have signs in the colonial language. And 4, all the factories that discriminate against French-speaking workers. They will all be targeted. Now, they call themselves suicide commandos, but no one killed themselves. Throughout the spring of 1963, a series of bomb attacks rocked Quebec, and a night watchman was killed outside a Canadian Forces recruitment center. Another man, a Canadian Forces bomb disposal expert, was critically wounded. On June 1st, 1963, 8 members of the FLQ were picked up by the RCMP, including Houdon and Villeneuve, and they were sentenced to 12 years in prison each for terrorism-related offenses. There was a lull, and then a group calling itself the Quebec Liberation Army stole $100,000 from a series of armed robberies. A larger group, the Revolutionary Army of Quebec, botched a robbery in 1964, which resulted in the death of 2 more deaths. I think they were guards. I'm not exactly sure though. This was accompanied then by more arrests. In 1965, a bunch of these pro-sovereignty terrorist groups merged together as the FLQ. And they launched more attacks, including one that killed an office worker in a shoe factory. A 15-year-old kid was blown up by his own bomb. Pierre Valliere and Charles Gagnon, his friend, fled to the US, where they were picked up by the police in front of the United Nations in New York, where they were protesting the imprisonment of their comrades. They were extradited. It was in the Manhattan House of Detention for Men that Valliere wrote his book. In 1969, the FLQ staged their biggest attack ever, bombing the Montreal Stock Exchange. The attack injured 27 people, but incredibly, it didn't kill anyone. They made up for it by killing a police officer during a police strike in 1969. Basically, for 7 years, 1963 to 1970, the RCMP and the FLQ played a game of revolutionary cat and mouse, or maybe a more accurate metaphor is whack-a-mole, which you often hear being used about fighting terrorism. This is because, like most terrorist groups, the FLQ was decentralized and most cells worked on their own. This was both their advantage and their disadvantage, you see. So most FLQ cells had little to no idea who was in the other cells or what they were up to, or even if there were other FLQ cells out there, or how many. The violence was mostly random. I mean, the targets were not necessarily random, but they weren't coordinated with other cells, okay? Attempts at organizing the FLQ into a single revolutionary party were unsuccessful because police informants would give them up as soon as that happened, right? The FLQ was dangerous and ideological, but it was not well organized. Whether the federal government knew this or not is one of the questions that still haunts us. So here we have, this is the Montreal Stock Exchange. after it was blown up. It really is amazing that no one was killed in this attack, because it was big. And then here we have Charles Gagnon. So that's Pierre Valliere's comrade. And he's speaking to reporters outside the United Nations in New York City. Okay, guys, let's stop there, take a little break, and we're going to come back and do the second part about the October crisis itself. Talk to you soon.